Hello, and welcome to the July 25th edition of the Cluster API Working Group as part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle in the Kubernetes community. So the first thing on the agenda today, I put a note here. Justin, Santa Barbara, and I were talking last week about dep, and in particular a feature that he let me know about called pruning. And so I sent a PR that enables dep pruning. And before getting it submitted, just wanted to mention it here and see if anybody objected to turning on dep pruning. Basically what it does is, instead of importing all of your transitive dependencies, it imports all of them and then actually just sort of deletes all the ones that you're not actually using in your code. The one little wrinkle here is that because of the API gen, we have to actually override the pruning behavior for a couple of libraries because we don't want to prune out the things we need to actually generate our API definitions. So if you look at the PR, we turn pruning on, and then there are a couple of things that I have to leave in there. Generally, it makes the vendor directory a little bit smaller, and I think Justin's other reason that they do this on COPS is because it makes it really obvious when you start actually using or removing dependencies, right? It's not the dependency code just happened to be there because you used part of the library, or it was part of it was used transiently. You actually see which parts are actually in use by your vendor. So unless there are any objections, I think we'll go ahead and put this in. Dims gave a +1 in chat. Please respond on the PR or mention something now if you feel like this is not a good idea. David, you've got the next agenda item.
How'd that happen? Okay, so there's Alejandro has a PR up, and Dims asked for some documentation on what is required of the external cluster. I don't think we know completely yet. I think kubeadm is required because the API server has to be deployed in the external cluster first. Is that correct?
It shouldn't be correct. I think like the external cluster we're using right now is Minikube, which happens to use kubeadm, but there's no reason that you need kubeadm. Like you just need a Kubernetes cluster on which to deploy that sort of initial bootstrapping stack. And when I talked to Jessica about this the other day, she said that the reason that there's an interface there for Minikube was to make it sort of easy to swap out if we decided that wasn't the best implementation.
Yeah, I was just looking for some kubectl commands that I need to run on local up cluster or some other way of starting up kube. The minimum that we need to run.
So you're asking for instructions on how you would set up an external cluster?
Yes. What are the components that we need to run that doesn't, that we need essentially?
I feel like that should be part of the kubeadm documentation.
Our components, not Kubernetes components.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything special about the components that we run, right? So we apply sort of the cluster API stack, which right now is an extension API server and a controller. We've talked about potentially moving that back to CRDs, which would sort of even shrink the sort of things that you need running in your cluster. But running a controller in the cluster is just starting a deployment. Like that should just sort of work anywhere. And even starting the extension API server, I would expect to be pretty portable. So I'm not sure there's anything in particular we care about from the bootstrapping cluster in terms of requirements, right? Like Minikube is a single node cluster, that's fine. Like it runs both the control plane and all your workloads on the same VM, and it works in that environment. So I would expect it to work in like a local up cluster too, without really any changes.
Sounds good. I was looking for any feature gates that are required or things like that.
Yeah, I don't think we're taking advantage of anything like that.
Or any components that need to be installed.
Yeah.
If there isn't anything, then I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, there's nothing I know of. I would try it, and if there is something, we should definitely document it. Because maybe Minikube happens to turn something on that we indirectly rely on.
Right. My idea was to try it with local up cluster and see what breaks.
So I tried deploying the API server to a cluster that wasn't created with kubeadm, and it failed because the manifest for the API server tries to cat the kubeadm config or tries to mount it, or it passes it as a parameter. I don't remember. At any rate, it references it. And so that's why I thought that the kubeam was an implicit requirement right now.
Right, and that's where I'm saying it might be like something like that might have sort of snuck in terms of getting this launched quickly, and we should sort of ferret those things out and fix them.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw that the provider component templates that I've seen, at least for OpenStack and GCE, did require a label that was a Kubernetes generated label to install certain things on the master. So I think that's in some of the templates, but yeah, I've seen that too.
Cindy, is that for the master that we deploy in the cluster we're creating, or is that for the master of what we call the external cluster that's used for bootstrapping?
Well, when you the provider components, which include like for OpenStack, it's got the controller manager and then the cluster and machine controllers.
Right.
Those try to use a label. It's looking for a label that has Kubernetes master or something like that on it. So it is kind of Kubernetes specific, at least in those templates that we put in GitHub.
We just copied what was in the GCE stuff. So yeah, it came from there. Yeah, we have to go back and fix it, I guess.
Oh, you're talking about the label that the node role.kubernetes.io/master.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was intended to be a generic label that was applied not just by kubeadm, but by other tools too. I'm not sure that's true.
And other things, well, I tried to deploy it on a Juju cluster. It was looking for directories that were known by kubeadm, but not by Juju, like to find the certs and also, what else? There was another one. Oh, the kube config.
Yeah, it looks like the example pod, mounts some local directories, which, assume a host operating system structure, and then it also mounts user bin kubeadmin to grab the kube config. So I think that those things are sort of one spec way of getting the data into the provider config in sort of the sample files, because they happen to work with kubeadmin, but I don't think there's anything in the code that you couldn't inject a kube config yourself in a different way and still have it work.
Agreed. So the question is just, do we need to do any more documentation now for that PR to be merged? The reason we're asking is we want our internal development workflow to be similar, and right now we have to manually fetch those changes.
Well, I wasn't trying to block the PR. I was just asking for information. So yeah, please go ahead.
I would love for us to figure out long-term what those dependencies are and remove them. If documenting them is, if someone's happy to document them, that's wonderful. But certainly, like when I try it, I will remove any Kubernetes dependencies.
Agreed.
That role, by the way, that when we about 2 years ago now, I think, when we needed the ability to put workloads onto the master and onto the node separately, there was almost universal agreement on the idea of doing that. There was one holdout, which is why it isn't official. But I guess now the argument would be that we don't actually want to differentiate maybe between a master and nodes. So we probably don't want to continue to push the labeling concept, but I imagine that everyone except OpenShift, shall we say, should be putting those labels on.
So the limitations for that right now, I believe, is just to be able to mount in the admin kube config. What we really probably need to do longer term is generate credentials for the controllers to be able to use that are more limited in scope and injecting those in via secret.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be really nice.
Okay.
All right, if there's something else on that one, if you're interested, the pull request is linked from the meeting notes. Please go take a look. It looks like it's had a number of different people comment on it already. And And so hopefully we can get some consensus. It doesn't look like it has an assignee right now, though. So we should try to figure out someone to actually review that so we can get merged. So next, put an agenda item. I just want to give an FYI. Over the past week, I've sent a couple of PRs and deleted all of the code under what used to be the cloud directory in the main repository. So the cloud Google code, I moved out into the new provider that we voted on creating last week. It's since been created, and the code has been moved over there. And for the vSphere code, there's an open issue to create a new provider, but nobody has taken that and actually created one yet. So what I've done for that is I've created a seed repository under my GitHub account. If someone wants to drive that through the steering committee to create a provider/vSphere, and then removed the vSphere code. I also put instructions on how I created that, so it's reproducible. If someone else wants to create their own seed repository, all the commit history is still here. We can still pull that out. But so the nice thing is that now everybody's on the same playing field, right? There's no sort of special code in the main repo. And then I also sent a PR to update documentation. And in particular, the documentation for cluster cuddle now has a big warning at the top, or will once the PR merges, saying this cluster cuddle doesn't actually do anything. You need to find a provider-specific cluster cuddle because of the following couple of GitHub issues. And so now that will hopefully incentivize us to go fix those GitHub issues so we can use a single cluster cuddle and not have everybody have their own cluster cuddle. All right, next, Conneal?
Cindy O'Neill.
Oh, Cindy. I'm sorry.
I should use.
I was trying to figure out where the break between first and last names was there. All right, go ahead, Cindy.
So we are looking. We're using cluster cuddle for the first time, and we looked at it. In our use case, we're installing everything on the external cluster as it does. We wanted to use a cluster other than Minikube, so that's why Alejandro made that change. But what I wanted to know is, why do we pivot everything from the external cluster to the created cluster? What is the advantage of that? And I just wanted to understand why we do that, and if it's needed for upgrades. So say you created a cluster in GCE. It looks like the controllers and all the machine and cluster resources are then copied over to that cluster. Is there a good reason to always do that, or that I'm sure there is, but I just want to understand.
I think it depends on how people want to operate. So like in our case, we want to have a central cluster that is managing a number of number of managed clusters. But it could be that you are not an infrastructure as a service company, right? Maybe you just have your own little Kubernetes cluster and you want the cluster API objects to exist within the cluster itself. And so that's just a choice to make by default. I don't know why we pivot by default, but I guess it's because we're assuming that not everyone's managing a bunch of clusters.
Is there already a way to, I didn't see a flag or anything to say I don't want to pivot to the new internal cluster. Is that something we want to add then? Because right now it is doing it.
I would vote yes. I think an option to override for people who have a control plane to manage their infrastructure, that makes a ton of sense to have option override. I think actually I would almost err that the default should not be to pivot, and it's something that you opt into.
I agree with that. That would be nice. Should I open an issue for that, or?
Yeah, I was seeing, it looks like Jessica's not on the line. I'm pretty sure that she wrote up a doc that was shared publicly that sort of describes why we did this. And I was trying to find it quickly, but I can't find it. So if you can open up an issue, then we can link the doc to there, maybe circle back next week after you've had a chance to read it. I think I agree, like an option not to pivot makes a lot of sense. I think pivoting is clearly the right answer if you are using Minikube, because you don't want to have to keep your Minikube up and running and functional to make sure your other cluster stays alive, especially if you're on a laptop and you accidentally, close your laptop or delete Minikube or go offline and your cluster is going to stop functioning, right? If you are, as the other PR we talked about suggests, using an existing cluster, especially if it's like a GKE type cluster where somebody else is making sure that stays running for you, then I think that makes a lot more sense, where you say, like, I can count on that cluster staying up and running, and I can just leave the thing in there instead of having to pivot into the other cluster.
Yeah, I think that would be easier to maintain since we're managing multiple clusters and different clouds to have it in one place. Okay, thanks.
Okay, David, you're up again with the next one.
Yeah, so I
API
searched the history and I didn't see anything on this. It sounds like a crazy idea, but the question was posed to me yesterday. If you were using a hosted solution, is there any reason to use cluster API? The only reason I could think of is maybe once the cluster autoscaler is rewritten against the cluster API, then you would want to have machine sets and machines, so the cluster autoscaler could autoscale in the same way, whether hosted or unhosted. But I couldn't think of any other good reasons.
I think for any software other than the autoscaler downstream, it's going to be important that Kubernetes distributions speak the cluster API. That's one thought off the cuff.
Sorry, you were saying for software in addition to the cluster autoscaler, or it's
yeah,
like you said, other than the cluster autoscaler, but I think you meant in addition.
Yeah, in addition to it.
So then would it make any sense to have an EKS provider?
I think so. I spoke with Bob at AWS about this, and they showed interest in either having some sort of shim that would speak the cluster API that goes on top of the APIs as they exist today. But I think it would be a powerful move for cloud providers with managed Kubernetes. I think it's just more of a political thing than anything at this point.
Weave is also interested in contributing to an EKS provider as well.
I think the other thing, there was a conversation we started last week about using CRDs, and I think Tim St. Clair had asked about sort of using this for existing clusters. And so I could also imagine a case where you might have a GKE or EKS cluster, and you added this to the cluster yourself to use that to manage machines.
So I don't know if it makes sense to have a quote unquote, the term provider is a little overloaded. It's a implementation for a given provider, where EKS is one solution for AWS. So I suck at naming, so don't ask me to think of a great name. But it's kind of an overloaded term. It's one of many choices for a given provider, where like even on GCP, you could have your own custom GCP integration as well as a GKE specific solution for a given provider.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you're using the word provider. Are you using provider to mean like the infrastructure provider, or is provider mean the provider of an implementation of a cluster API?
Exactly. Like I suck at naming. I don't know how we want to, disambiguate the two choices there. I usually term cloud provider as a general term, and then the EKS or GKE or AKS are given implementation choices of a Kubernetes cluster or deployment.
Can we open an issue on this? I think getting the vernacular correct here is pretty important.
I can open an issue.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure we actually answered Daniel's question. If we want to kind of get back to that, do other people have thoughts about sort of the cluster API plus hosted Kubernetes solutions?
Yes, so I think the same issue was discussed some time back as well, when somebody posed the question, what if the machine, I just want to run the machine controller against the GKE, right? And there was also a note there that we should make sure that the cluster API controller and the machine controller are as independent as possible from each other. They should not have such a tight coupling that you cannot run the only machine controller in the GK, and that was also one of the reasoning that why we did not wanted to put the pointers from the machine controller to the cluster controller as a necessary field. Right? Just wanted to add that we had this maybe buried down in the notes somewhere.
One thing I wanted to bring up in this space of cloud-specific controllers with existing Kubernetes distributions is when we start to approach larger scale, we're going to have to look at how do we solve creating and destroying that many instances at one time. I know in Amazon, you get to a certain point where if you try to do it manually through the EC2 API, you're going to run into problems and you pretty much are forced to use autoscale groups at that point. So just food for thought.
Do you know about what that limit is?
I don't, but I bet we can find out and get back to folks. I would say like I haven't done anything more than like a couple hundred EC2 instances with success.
Okay, so on the order of 100 or so, we're probably okay. But if we want to talk about 1,000, we are probably not okay. And somewhere in the middle, it's going to break.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
I wonder if were you creating them all in the same AZ?
Same region, multiple AZs. And it was more of, I think at first the API, like the rate limiting of the API kicked in and I just wasn't able to issue enough requests. And then after I got over that limit, ultimately like the machines just like started taking longer and longer to come up.
And you're saying that's not true with autoscaling groups. With autoscaling groups, you can say, give me 1,000 machines, and they are not throttled in the same way.
Yeah, autoscale groups bypasses the EC2 API and does some weird internal magic that we don't have access to.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It's probably doing something that we can't do, right?
Yeah.
And just for the record, I think to date we have used autoscaling groups for nodes in both KubeUp and kops, so we would not necessarily know about this on AWS.
I hit it when I was working on Kubicorn and ultimately switched over to ASGs like kops.
The very early versions of KubeUp did not use makes on GCP, but I think we'd switched over before we ported KubeUp to other platforms. And at that time, we were not creating a large number of nodes for clusters, right? It was probably orders of tens, maybe 100, but definitely not more than 100.
And Chris, yeah, we should definitely ask AWS about some details, but Chris, did you try a single run instances call with multiple, with like 100 instances in there?
No, I was doing individual instances.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can, sort of, I don't like, is it aggregation where you like look to see if you have like 100 calls in the queue and you squash them type thing?
Yeah. Yeah, it might be interesting to go through and kind of like push the boundaries here a little bit and just get some numbers so that we know what we're working with. And then on second thought, this isn't even specific to managed Kubernetes. This is controllers in general.
Yeah, so this comes back to a conversation we had a long time ago, which was, should we use MIGS ASGs or not? And at the time, we erred on the side of not. Maybe that's worth readdressing, or maybe it's worth making sure that the API is sort of compatible with those sort of cloud infrastructure machine groupings, so that if you create a machine deployment or a machine set, maybe you get an ASG, and if you create a singleton machine, maybe we just use a singleton API. And then if people want to create hundreds, we tell them that they should be using the higher level constructs, right? That complicates controllers a little bit, though.
This may be like a new opinion, but I think it would be better if we prefer ASGs over individual EC2 instances or individual compute instances, because that would make the autoscaler implementation so much more easy to handle rather than trying to scale up individual VMs.
Can you explain a little bit more why you think that's the case?
So currently, we run like a hand-built cluster in AWS using Terraform and stuff. And we use ASGs for the worker nodes, and we use the cluster autoscaler to keep the cluster elastic, like it can grow and shrink as demand, as the workload on the cluster demands. So the cluster autoscaler kind of seamlessly plugs in, and it is able to interact with the ASG APIs out of the box, and that may be something folks may be interested in running to keep their cluster elastic.
So I think this kind of depends on the provider implementation. The reason historically that we've used ASGs is because it's a really easy way to update the IP addresses for your load balancer when nodes come and go. But the cluster API provider could also do that. So.
And just to add on that, right? So because I have dealt with integration of cluster autoscaler and the machine controller manager, so the cluster autoscaler community has already decided that they will eventually get rid of the cloud provider specific code, which means right now what's happening is that the core logic is separate, where all the complicated stuff is happening, when to scale up, when to scale down, and so on. But then there is a slight driver code where it basically calls the ASGs in AWS and node sets in Azure and so on. So those parts will eventually be removed from the cluster autoscaler, and the expectation is that cluster autoscaler will just talk to the machine deployment or machine set and tell it what to do and what not to do, right? So the benefit that we were getting till now only for the AWS so-called from the autoscaler will not be there anymore. But that's one point. And the second point, that why on the first time that we decided to go for the bare VMs and not the ASGs. So one of the clear, when we will try to deploy the recommendations for different providers in terms of machine controller, right? Unfortunately, not all cloud providers are offering nice features like ASG. So from the experiences, ASG as such works great for the AWS, but if you see the other providers, some would have different kind of features and different kind of terminologies for the same autoscaling group feature. So that will eventually create a lot of confusions. And about the rate limiting part. So we have also actually faced the rate limiting issue, and I think more or less it comes from the point that it's what I have understood so far. It's not related to ASG or bare EC2 instances. It's about the account, subscription, and how many VMs created there. And AWS, I think documentation itself says that per hour, it allows only certain number of calls to any EC2 instance. So for example, if you're crossing 1,000 calls in your account to the EC2 instances per 10 seconds or 20 seconds, then AWS will start showing the error that now you are crossing the rate limiting. So that's what we have seen even for the bare EC2 instances. And I think the same thing goes on for other providers as well, that you have at some point they stop you from making the calls to the service, rather than having 100 VMs and rather than stopping from creating more instances.
If it's helpful, we can ask in, I think we have SIG AWS, I was going to say tomorrow, it's on Friday, and I can bring it up, or someone can bring it up there, and we can try to get some guidance from inside the walls, as it were, as to what the truth might be. I think I would just add one extra point about why a reason maybe to consider using not to use autoscaling groups would be that if we have more complicated requirements that are difficult to express in autoscaling groups, then we are able, we have full control over exactly what we run. So if we wanted to run a particular instance type, or an instance in a particular zone, because we need to attach a volume, for example, it is easier to express that than it would be to express that in autoscaling groups, where we'd probably have to do multiple autoscaling groups, I think, or we'd have to launch the instance and attach it to the autoscaling group, I guess. I don't know, but that's a potential reason to go one at a time.
So you're saying like dealing with heterogeneous clusters would be difficult using autoscaling groups?
Yes, and not even necessarily that heterogeneous if it was if it's the case of zones, right, where we know we need a volume in a particular zone. I mean, that's easily overcome by having 3 autoscaling groups, and I think there's also a trick where you launch the instance and attach it to the autoscaling group. I think that's allowed, but it's that sort of thing where we're starting to have to jump through hoops, and maybe those if we don't need to jump through those hoops, that is a reason, just sort of, pros and cons. It is a pro of launching one instance at a time.
So that said, the auto scaling group does give you the ability to kind of create instances more evenly across availability zones if you're looking to do a multi-AZ deployment as well, instead of having to manage that manually as well. So again, trade-offs.
Right. And we might not want even, right? If we, for whatever reason, had all our PVs in one zone, we might want to put them all in that zone, right? So, but yeah, just a consideration. But I'll follow up with SIG AWS and find out what the whether there's any advantage in terms of rate limiting, doing it one way or the other, and just to get it to happen.
So on the rate limiting front, my observation using the ASGs has been similar. Like I have seen the autoscaler periodically polls like the limits on the ASGs and how much it can scale up to, and there's that loop running in the autoscaler. So by default, that loop is super aggressive, and that aggressive loop will often result in like throttling from the AWS APIs. So that has been my observation using ASGs. So for that reason, we've like toned down the frequency at which the autoscaler polls the ASG or calls the ASG APIs.
I think that's a separate limit than what Chris was talking about, because Chris was saying if you're calling the EC2 APIs to create and delete individual machines, you get auto-scaled. And you're talking about calling the autoscaler API. I don't know if Amazon distinguishes between those two API services with different rate limits. I know at Google there's sort of more fine-grained rate limits applied across the API surface.
So I think they do distinguish. I mean, certainly there's one API call to make an auto-scaling group where there's 100 API calls to make 100 machines. But Justin reminded me of a really good reason not to use ASGs. So we should think about this more. The reason is ASGs will attempt to balance nodes across zones, but it will not guarantee it. And so if you're depending on always having 3 zones to survive AZ failure, you cannot rely on ASG to provide you that.
Can you create multiple ASGs and only have the ASG for a specific zone now?
That's what I recommend in those cases.
Yeah. So that way you still have a guarantee, but you're just managing 3 ASGs instead of 1, or however many zones.
Right, and I think that the cluster API would support both those, right? In the machine deployment, you could say, or the machine set, I want a machine set in this region, and our controller or an ASG would then presumably try to do some best effort spreading. And if you said, I want a machine set in this zone, then you'd pin everything to that zone, right? And I think that you can express both of those things in the API. And so if you want the simplicity of just having like one machine set, and you're okay with it being a little bit imbalanced depending upon the underlying cloud provider, you would just say, give me a machine set in this region. And if you really want to make sure things are very evenly distributed, then like Chris was saying, you would just create 3 or 4 or however many zones in that region that you want it to be in.
And you actually just reminded me, there is actually a huge reason to run some auto-scaling groups, which is that they have the functionality that they can recover from a power off. So there is an external source of truth that will basically turn on that first master, for example. So if you are in a scenario where all your instances are shut down for whatever reason, if you have an auto-scaling group that brings up your first master, which is then able to bootstrap everything else, you will recover. If not, you'll get paged at 2 a.m. or whatever it is. So
yeah, that's a good point. You can have the launch configuration for that auto-scaling group to bring up that instance exactly.
I'm wondering if with ASGs, sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit, but I wonder if we can get into a scenario where there's some sort of undesired behavior in EC2. The ASG is working on it behind the scenes. The cluster API controller also detects there's some sort of something's wrong, like we're missing a machine, and it tries to create a new machine, whereas the ASG is already fixing it, and we end up creating 2 machines instead of 1.
Okay, so I guess the summary that I'm hearing is, sort of revisiting the discussion we had before about ASGs versus managing individual VMs. There are some good points that have been brought up that I'm not sure were discussed before about why ASGs might be a better choice. There's some concern about fragmentation of the user experience. If we can use ASGs on Amazon, but maybe not have an equivalent on somewhere like DigitalOcean. And so it might be worth exploring maybe an implementation of the API using ASGs to see what the sort of drift in user experience is, and if there's any sort of dissonance with the API to the underlying groups on the cloud provider. I think Chris just mentioned about who's in control of the different machines, et cetera, and make sure that sort of maps over.
Just as a meta point to this topic, though, I don't see how a drift in user experience isn't a fait accompli across providers, even if they have ASGs or not, right? That's just providers will be wildly different in their behavior.
I think in some ways, yes. I mean, I think that from the API contract point of view, the fields that we promote to the top level of the API, we want to make sure that those do work across providers and that you can have a similar experience where if you say, I would like, a machine with this version of the qubit with these taints and labels on it, that happens, right? And the time it takes for that to happen might be different. The mechanism by which it happens might be different. The way you specify machine sizes and shapes and extra attributes might be different. But I think that the pieces we want to put at the top level of the API are things we think we can make be a consistent experience. So I think that's more where I'm worried about dissonance, is if there are things that we believe should be in the API to make a good user experience, or they match the sort of Kubernetes style, and those don't translate down to MIGs or ASGs, that's where I would feel like there'd be a problem. So on the other hand, I've been trying to take stuff out of that API surface and to make it really small. So maybe that's also helping kind of close the gap. All right, so in summary, if someone wants to explore building on top of ASGs, I think that would be a really interesting piece of data to come back to the group with and let us know how that worked out. And from the Google side, we can see if somebody wants to do that with MIGs also. All right, so next, provider implementers office hours.
Yeah, thanks everybody for filling out the doodle. These are the office hours that are meant to sort of share share information, tips, hurdles among everybody that's working on specific provider implementations. Things that maybe don't make sense to discuss in the meeting that we're having now. Anyway, the most popular slots, from what I can tell on the doodle, appear to be, these 4. And a lot of people can attend either A or D or B or C, approximately. So just wanted to ask if do we like another vote, or can we just choose one of these slots, A or D or B or C, and I guess that would give us 2 weekly slots, one for one group of people and one for another. We've met last week and yesterday on Tuesday. We had a few people attending. Been recording the sessions. We've got a meeting notes. That's, I think I added a link to that in the top level SIG cluster lifecycle doc. Anyway, and then I guess the final question I had is, are we leaving anyone out from the Eastern Hemisphere? Because the slots are, from the morning to the late afternoon and Pacific Standard Time. I asked that on the Slack last week, but I didn't hear back from anybody. But yeah, let me know. want to make sure that there are slots for everybody. Oh, that conflicts with the community meeting. Okay.
Yeah, at least B and C would be, I think I did not get a chance to look at it before, but from here it looks like B and C is pretty horrible for us because it will translate to 4 a.m. A and D is still okay, can be manageable. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it looks like D, that conflicts with the community meeting. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. At some point, I imagine there were going to be conflicts between some Kubernetes meeting, whatever slot we choose. But in any case, yeah, like I said, we've been meeting at slot B, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, we can have, I guess, as many slots as people want to attend. I guess we want to balance, you know, not fragmenting it too much, right? Because we sort of want to share the information as much as possible. Yeah. Any more voting to do, or are we okay with you know, like picking one slot from these two sort of clusters?
I think you just pick a spot and go for it. And if problems arise, let's track them downstream and just make sure that we're diligent about recording everything while we get started.
Any objections to having 2 weekly slots, as long as somebody can host another one? Because it looks like there are a lot of people who, right, can attend just like the one out of the sorry, well, yeah, they're like these two clusters. So like if we can have 2 meetings, that looks like it would cover most of the people who are interested.
Yeah, I think 2 meetings are fine. I think, again, just making sure that we're diligent about notes and recordings and keeping the meeting information somewhat separated so that we're not convoluting it all together. But yeah, that sounds fine to me if we can find people to own either meeting.
Okay. All right. Yeah. If anybody, so I'll send an email out to the list. And if somebody, so I'll host slot B, and if somebody can maybe host one of the slots A or D, you know, let me know. I'll reach out on Slack too.
One other thing I'll mention is I can add the slots to the community calendar and send out invites to people. I know I've missed the 2 that have happened, even though I've meant to be there because they weren't on my calendar. So I think that would be really helpful as we actually settle and say, yes, we're going to do this slot. Like, we should put it on the calendar so that people remember to go or remember that it's an option.
Okay. Also, just in the name of clerical items, I gave Daniel the cluster ops account that we use for both. For now, we would be using it for this meeting, SIG cluster lifecycle, and Kube admin office hours, and these office hours. So at some point, there might be some conflicts there, and I don't know how we want to navigate Zoom moving forward.
Yeah.
I think so far, non-overlapping, I think partly because there are people that might want to go to multiple of them, right?
Hey, can I ask a simple question? I'm new to this meeting. What takes place at these office hours?
So we're just, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh no, so who the various people that are working on the provider implementations, whether it's, you know, for like an AWS provider, I'm working on an SSH provider. We share, you know, sort of our lessons learned and tips, hurdles, and sort of talk about the design, talk about how we're using the common cluster API parts. Maybe we talk about, you know, how we're designing our provider specs, statuses, etc., things like that. So things that don't necessarily get discussed in this meeting because they're not really common to, the top level cluster API.
Great, thanks.
One last question I had is, so I've been recording those office hours, but I've been recording them to the quote unquote Zoom cloud, and I see that the links that we have for the recordings in this meeting are YouTube. So maybe offline, if somebody can help me figure out what I'm supposed to do there to make sure that we don't lose those recordings.
Yeah, I don't know what happens when you record to Zoom Cloud. I always record locally and then upload to YouTube and then publish them onto our SIG playlist on YouTube.
What happens when you use the cloud, Zoom Cloud, is it costs money? And I did it once and somebody called me and stopped doing that. So.
All right.
Yeah. Daniel, if you want to sync up after this or put some time on the calendar, I'm happy to go through all of this and add you to the playlist and get you everything you need.
Thanks. Okay. I'll ping you. Thanks.
Cool. All right, that is the end of our agenda for today. Does anyone have any last minute things they'd like to add?
Just one thing, so more of a generic. So do we have any timelines or anything for alpha exit or anything?
I think we talked about this briefly last week. I think at least my personal goal is alpha sometime within sort of the next Kubernetes release cycle. I've been trying to burn down there's a milestone list of GitHub issues. So if people are interested in helping get that alpha out the door, please take a look at those issues and help reduce them to 0.
Thanks.
Also, I just wanted to throw this out here to folks. The KubeCon CFPs are still open. If anybody here wants to submit a CFP for cluster API stuff, I'm happy to help you write your CFP and go over it with you. Feel free to ping me offline.
All right. With that, thanks everyone for coming. I guess we had the office hours yesterday, so we'll see people next week at office hours, or next week at this meeting, or at the main Cluster Lifecycle meeting. Lots of meetings now, so we'll see lots of friendly faces. Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you. Bye.